Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Rabbi in Residence session. The last for this calendar year, actually, until about Rosh Hashanah. So the next calendar year will continue. But in the meantime, I just want to tell you, turn off any devices that might distract you. Get comfortable. You're in for an extraordinary hour. We've really been honored to have some of the greatest rabbis in the country speak to us over the last 2 or 3 years. This program that Wendy Levinson originated was as a result of Zoom and COVID and these realities of not being together. And it enabled us to bring in to our midst, to our house of worship and house of learning, which means our homes in these cases, some of the greatest thinkers. And tonight is an extraordinary example of that level of thinking, writing, speaking. It's just such an honor to have Rabbi Ritz Greenberg with us. Not here in Los Angeles, it's not evening. He's not sitting back having just had dinner. It's 5 a.m. in Jerusalem. So with my deepest gratitude to him, I want to now say to all of you, I'm sure you're going to have comments and questions. I have no doubt, knowing the speaker and knowing the talk that he's going to give, not the content of it, but the subject. So what I want to suggest is orient yourself for the moment right now. Go back to the Zoom, have a look where you see either chat or Q&A. Raising your hand won't be effective. We won't be able to call on you verbally, but chat or Q&A, and I promise you, we will include your questions. All right, let me reintroduce Wendy to you to introduce our wonderful Rabbi Ritz Greenberg.
Thank you, Rabbi. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our last Rabbi in Residence session before our summer break. You're in store for a special treat tonight, and we're so glad that you're here with us. It is my privilege to introduce you to Rabbi Ritz Greenberg, who is coming to us from Israel, where it is 5 o'clock in the morning. So we are so grateful to you for your willingness to speak to us at this hour. Not only that, but today is Rabbi Greenberg's 91st birthday, but he still wanted to be here with us. In fact, he told me that he considered the session with us his birthday present, since his favorite activity is teaching and speaking with people. It is truly an honor to have you here with us tonight. I met Rabbi Greenberg over 40 years ago at the Brandeis Bardeen Institute when he used to be a scholar in residence there. When I read his recent articles in the Jewish Journal, I knew that he would be a perfect fit for our program. Rabbi Greenberg is a prominent Jewish thinker, scholar, author, and educator. He is known as a promoter of greater understanding between Judaism and Christianity. He serves as the president of the J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life, and he is the senior scholar in residence at the Hadar Institute. Rabbi Greenberg was ordained by Beth Joseph Rabbinical Seminary of Brooklyn, New York, and has a PhD in history from Harvard University. He has had a long and notable career in the service of the Jewish people. He served in the rabbinate at the Riverdale Jewish Center in the 1960s. He also served as professor and chairman of the Department of Jewish Studies of City College of the City University of New York. Together with Elie Wiesel, he founded the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership and served as its president until 1997. From 1997 to 2008, he served as founding president of Jewish Life Network Steinhardt Foundation, which created such programs as Birthright Israel and the Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education. Rabbi Greenberg was one of the activist founders of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry in the movement to liberate Russian Jewry. He was a pioneer in the development of Holocaust education and commemoration. When Elie Wiesel served as chairman of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, Rabbi Greenberg served as its executive director. The commission recommended and drew the blueprint for the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on the National Mall in Washington. He served as the museum's chairman from 2000 to 2002. Rabbi Greenberg has written extensively on post-Holocaust Jewish religious thought, Jewish-Christian relations, pluralism, and the ethics of Jewish power. He and his wife, Blue, reside in Jerusalem, and we are so honored to have him here with us tonight. Welcome, Rabbi Greenberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Wendy, for that very extensive, maybe overgenerous introduction. Yes, and I am happy to greet you from Jerusalem. And as you mentioned, this I consider a birthday celebration because the single most, my favorite activity has been as a teacher and as a lecturer. So I thank you for the opportunity to celebrate in this way. Of course, our topic is a very serious one, and I speak to you at a moment where I think there is a kind of a general sense of crisis, maybe even depression in the Jewish world, and certainly in the land of Israel. October 7th, obviously, was a shocking and traumatic, really, day for everybody. And of course, as been said ad infinitum, more Jews were killed on this day than any single day since the Holocaust itself. And indeed, that day evoked sense of Holocaust. I think it was particularly devastating in Israel because one is the most important, in my judgment, was the hostages, the Israeli people, the Jewish people, and really Arabs as well. The sacredness of life, the sense of that your most beloved ones are stolen, kidnapped, and held, and the fact that Israel has not been able to get them back. 250 were kidnapped. We're down to 136, of which probably at least a third are dead already. But the fact that they are still held, I think, is a major factor in the depression. Secondly, I think we're all shocked, and it is very sad to see the worldwide support for Hamas. It's one thing to speak about the compassion, sympathy for the Palestinians. It's another thing to see the outright and outrageous support for Hamas, quote, by any means necessary, another euphemism for saying that it was okay that they not only killed the 1,200 people, but that they beheaded, that they killed children in front of parents, that they raped and abused. And to see this as openly, sympathetically supported is very depressing thought. And of course, the third, not least factor, is this worldwide upsurge of anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, so we're talking at a moment where we're really all wrestling with this question. American Jewry, too. We're shocked by the upsurge of worldwide anti-Semitism. I would say maybe even frightened by the sense that in America, which we almost took for granted as a major breakthrough in the history of exile and diaspora, that they finally had put anti-Semitism to rest, or at least weakened it to the point where it was not respectable. To see it come back with such intensity, both from the right, the extreme right, and from the so-called progressive left, it is very upsetting, and we sort of wonder, what do we do next and how do we respond? So let me start by saying there's one hidden blessing in disguise, very much disguised, but it is a blessing. In Israel, the recognition that what Hamas did on October 7th, as it were, it undermined the so-called the conceptia, the self-deluding maybe belief that Hamas was deterred militarily, that it had turned from the group committed to destroy Israel to a group that wanted to rule Gaza, that wanted to improve life there. This has enabled Israel to live with what, in retrospect, was a wrong situation, namely that Hamas would, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad would from time to time unleash rockets, mostly in the nearby areas, so-called envelope of Gaza, and people would have to run for cover. And of course, the Iron Dome minimized human suffering and tragedy and casualties, but still, to have lived with that, looking back, no country would agree to live under a constant reign of terror and violence of this type. And of course, from time to time, Israel did try to calm them down. There would be short-term military interventions, and of course, it would quiet down for a year or two and then start over again. That conception collapsed and only puts there is, I believe, a national consensus across right, left, secular, religious, and really Jewish and Arab Israel, that Hamas cannot be lived with, that it must be eliminated. And in effect, after 50 years, Israel woke up to say we have to take the Hamas charter, the founding covenant or document of that organization, seriously. And you have probably heard and seen these things. For example, quote from the actual founding document, the constitution, as it were, of Hamas. Israel will exist and will continue to exist only until Islam will obliterate it. And of course, that is the commitment of Hamas to obliterate Israel. And it goes on to say, there is no solution for the Palestinian people except jihad, that is to say, relentless and unforgiving war until it's brought to its knees. And of course, it specifically only says peace negotiations, peace settlements are an illusion, and they reject this in principle, not even worth trying for. If Hamas was just out to destroy Israel, we might say Dayenu. But as you know, in its own charter, it also, and then it goes on to quote a famous or infamous hadith that said that the day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight Jews and kill the last of them. In fact, the hadith, which is the oral tradition interpreting Quran, concludes that the last of the Jews is trying to hide in the tree, tells the Muslim warriors, hiding behind me is the last Jew, find them and kill them. So people understood now that this is not just verbal, take it seriously, because they intend to act on it. And in fact, not only did they act on it on October 7th, but as a number of their own major leaders said, we will do this again and again and again. Now, the truth is that Hamas, I think, is not able to wipe out Israel per se, but they do believe, and it's not impossible, that they can wipe out livability, that they can make life so miserable that Israel sort of kind of gives up. And that is, in fact, their continuing goal. So there's a national consensus, and this is the first time, to not simply have a limited intervention, but to confront militarily Hamas until it is destroyed. And in fact, Israel's IDF assumes and assesses that in this past 6-7 months, that it has wiped out 18 of the 24 battalions, or at least damaged them beyond repair, of the fighting battalions of Hamas. Now, this is what brings us to the second challenge. Hamas, and this is a general rule of the terrorist, tries to fight within the cover and protection of the civilian population. In a sense, we now discover that in the past 15 years, when, well, 2006, so it's already 18 years, that their control of Hamas, of Gaza, that they have actually spent billions of dollars. In fact, all the money that came in foreign aid, overwhelmingly by the billions, was taken and turned not to improving or rebuilding Gaza, but into building military tunnels on an extensive list and fortifying and buying arms and all kinds of weapons and capacity to inflict damage on the state of Israel. So they have taken advantage of those years, and Israel came to the universal conclusion, and it has to stop and it has to be wiped out. But in that very process, Hamas has been successful, placing its command control centers in hospitals, in mosques, in schools, connecting its tunnels to civilian homes, enabling them to come out of an attack from many different areas. They have basically turned the population of Gaza into human shields, and at the same time depriving them, not building air raid shelters, not building the kind of safe rooms that Israel builds for its own citizens, in effect because they have decided that one of the best ways they can fight is to expose their own civilians to be killed, because that creates world support and sympathy and pressure on Israel to stop fighting. So in effect, this has been a great success on their part, and this is a major factor in world response to the war itself, and that is to say, the world, that means the UN, the media, the international community, has accepted Hamas's so-called Ministry of Health of Gaza as a source of reliable statistics. And the main point that they have made is the extensive death and killing of Palestinian civilians. And it's an interesting and a very important moment that we talk about those civilians. On the one hand, because in my judgment, those civilian deaths are heartbreaking. They are something that Israel regrets and has made every effort to prevent. Unfortunately, has not made clear that that's its policy, and I will come back to that in just a minute. So the truth is there is and should be sympathy for the Palestinians, and that should start with Jews and Israelis. The death of any innocent civilian is heartbreaking. We understood in taking responsibility for sovereignty, for taking responsibility. This is one of the great transformations of Jewish history, to take responsibility for our fate. Zionism, the Jewish people made a decision, and frankly, mostly after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. Only a small percentage, 3, 4, 5% of the Jewish people were Zionists who moved to Israel in the 19th and early 20th century. But after the Holocaust, the whole Jewish people realized that the key to the destruction of the Jews was their powerlessness. They had no army to defend themselves. They had no country or government that would give them haven or protection. And therefore, the Nazis successfully were able to destroy 6 million Jews, able to torment, torture, and slowly degrade millions of Jews throughout that whole period. So the whole Jewish people understood we have no choice but to take power and to take responsibility to protect ourselves, and that's what Israel is about. The tragedy here is that in doing that, in defending ourselves, it is a tragedy that we have to kill civilian population as well. And again, I want to make clear, very important for all of us to understand, that in fact, Israel in every war, including this one, has made incredible effort to minimize civilian casualties and to obey international humanitarian law in this area, because they're more committed than anybody else to proportionality, to only fighting out of necessity. And when you do fight, you make sure that in killing the fighters, you do your best to not kill an unusual or excessive amount of Palestinians. And I want to call your attention to something that just emerged in the last 2 weeks. Up till 10 days ago, Hamas's numbers were universally accepted and used. They claimed that 35,000 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza war. They never separated fighters and civilians, but they made it even more damning. First of all, they made it even more damning by insisting that 70% of the victims of the casualties were women and children. And that looks very damning and sounds very damning. In the last 10 days, the UN admitted, although it tried to mask and subtly cover what it was admitting, that in fact, only 24,000 deaths have been confirmed or established by checking hospital records, by doing actual direct contact with the name and knowledge of this person who died. Not 35,000, but 24,000. And the other 10,000 are based on Hamas claims, which they claim, Hamas claims is based on, quote, reliable media. Now, what does that mean? Reliable media. It's very likely that this is an exaggeration, but even more important than that, the UN now admits that the number of women and children killed that they have established is half, 50% of what they claimed 10 days ago, up to 10 days ago. And it means that the whole claim that women and children are 70%, which is another way of saying Israel must be targeting civilians, is false. Now, again, to me, it's a heartbreak to know that 9,000 women or 5,000 children have died. It is certainly a tragedy, and one regrets it deeply. But there is no choice, and they'll come to this in just a second. There is no choice because Israel has had to fight back and defend itself. Otherwise, it would be killed and wiped out systematically. Now, what do I say about Israel taking the effort? The real test of a moral army, the real test of a moral war is if you take the effort, how do you reduce the number of civilian casualties? And the measure is the comparison of how many fighters are killed for every civilian. Richard Kemp, who was the head of the British forces in Afghanistan and a major figure in the Allied force, which of course was led by America, said that they concluded that they could never win this war in Afghanistan unless they won over the civilian population. And so they made a major effort, an unprecedented effort, to reduce civilian casualties, reviewing procedures, trying to scratch missions that would kill civilians and not fighters, et cetera, et cetera. And by a superhuman effort, as they described it, the Allied forces got the ratio of civilians killed to fighters down to 3 or 4 civilians for every fighter killed. And that is not a negative number. That's the best any army ever did as far as they can tell. Particularly remarkable because the terrorists, in this case the Taliban, embed themselves in a civilian population, which raises civilian casualties. Israel, if you take apart that 24,000 number, it's about 14,000, 14 to 15,000 Hamas fighters, Israel's best estimate of how many it killed. So you're talking 15,000 fighters compared to 10,000 civilians. That's a ratio of less than 1 civilian for every fighter. If you take the 35,000 number and say, well, I can't document every death anyway, it would be 20,000 civilians compared to 15,000 fighters. So it's a 1.3 or 1.4 ratio. Those are unprecedented numbers in history, not just in this particular war. And again, how do you do that? You have to keep in mind, it starts with the fact that Israel does not target civilian places, schools, mosques, hospitals, homes. It does not target at all. It makes sure not to bomb and not to attack. Secondly, except, and that's the reason why the casualties are higher this time, except where Hamas has turned hospitals into command and control centers, as they did at Shifa Hospital, the leading hospital in Gaza. They did it twice, as they did in Nasser Hospital and numerous other hospitals, in mosques, in schools, and most of all, in private homes. Not only placing arms in private homes, but connecting them to tunnels so they could go in and out and attack by surprise. So the point is, despite this, Israel has kept the ratios low. How do you do that? Well, the answer is you still attack only those kinds of targets that are clearly civilian, military and not civilian. You make sure that you literally stop missions when the fighter pilot or the drone shows that too many civilians are near the fighters or near the terrorists and will be killed. Israel develops special munitions and special weapons, the so-called iron mortar, the iron hammer, they call it, a mortar that fires munitions that don't scatter. Because when you fire at a group of fighters and they are embedded in a civilian population, the scatter kill civilians. So they develop special munitions. And one could go on with all the efforts that are made. Now, of course, you ask if that's true, how come there are so many civilian casualties? Well, the answer in part, as I said, is that the civilian casualties are embedded or next door to or part of a civilian setting that has been turned into a military effort. The other major reason for the major number of more casualties is quite bluntly the impact and the judgment post-October 7th. In the past, Israel focused its firing on the leaders and the belief that they're the ones who are instigating and carrying out these activities and killing them. What Israel came to realize after October 7th is that the rank and file of Hamas, the 3,000 fighters who invaded Israel, who killed and raped and beheaded and burnt and so on, they were the fighters, not just the leaders. And Israel's recognition that these are people who are committed. It's a kind of a death cult. They committed to kill Israel, Jews, Israelis. They, in fact, killed Arabs and Bedouins on October 7th, too. So they tried to kill Israelis. That Israel has no choice but to recognize that with the fighters, not just the leaders, it's kill or be killed. It's eliminate them before they continually attack and commit and eliminate you. Now, again, it's heartbreaking that our defense of our freedom, of our right to exist, can only be done by fighting. And it's equally heartbreaking that this fighting, because of the way Hamas set it up, is killing civilians on the side. I want to point out the heartbreak also is that Israel's soldiers, that Israel's own casualties have been much more than any previous war except the Yom Kippur War. And that's because, again, there's no choice if you fight. And if you fight and you don't use the maximum weapons because you want to avoid civilian casualties, Israel is paying a very heavy price too. But that is the reality. And again, one of the major ways that Israel has maintained or lowered the number of losses has been the evacuation. In order to avoid losses in battle, Israel evacuates. And in fact, it evacuates its own citizens. 150,000 Israeli citizens from the south near Gaza and from the north near Lebanon, near Hezbollah, have been evacuated. Their lives turned upside down. Well, in the same way, Israel called upon and evacuated almost 1 million Palestinians. Because again, had they not been evacuated, the deaths would have been not 20,000 or 30,000, but hundreds of thousands. And so again, Israel has received a tremendous drubbing public relations and the media look at you, forced all these people to become refugees, instead of recognizing that this was the only way that lives could be saved, precisely because Hamas is embedded in their midst. So this is a major transformation, and this is a major factor. This is a major factor in the situation that the losses in the Palestinians are higher than ever before. And as I say, it's heartbreaking, but in the real world, it's the only way in which, otherwise, Hamas has developed the ultimate genocidal successful tactic. I talk about this, I say it's not a joke, but it's ironic and funny in its own way. Hamas has achieved the famous definition of chutzpah, you all recall. The famous definition of chutzpah is that the person kills his parents, father and mother, and then pleads for mercy on the grounds that he's an orphan. Well, what Hamas has done is basically started by setting up civilian shields, placing its own military behind civilians who will be killed in order to attack them. It then attacked Israeli civilians primarily. And then, having successfully killed and attacked thousands of civilians, it then pleads, you can't shoot back because you're going to hurt or kill civilians. And they have gotten away with this. In essence, to me, of course, America has stood by Israel on this question. But the truth is the media and the international community has let them get away with this claim that Israel has no right to defend itself or fight back because it will kill civilians, and we can't let the genocidal killers get away with that. Now, some other general comments very important. One is the worldwide support for Hamas, and in particular in the radical, so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which has defended not just Palestinians, but Hamas itself. And you saw in the demonstrations on the campus, and for that matter, in many of the statements and spokesmen, there was support for Hamas October 7th behavior, the atrocities and the rapes notwithstanding. And the justification is, quote, that Israel is colonialist settlers, unquote. Now, again, there's a triple lie in that, and it's a particularly bad triple lie because it justifies the cruelest genocidal intentions. Why is it a lie? Number one is the claim that Israel, the Jews of Israel, are colonial settlers. The truth is, as you all know, Jews are the indigenous people in this so-called morality of woke, or the so-called morality of the human rights. The indigenous people are innocent and the ones who deserve to be protected. Well, the Jews are the indigenous people of this land of Israel. And the truth is that biblical Israel, Jews lived in Israel as far back as 1800 to 1600 BCE. That is to say, almost 2,400 years before Islam was born. So there were no Muslims, there were no Palestinians living in Israel for more than 2,000 years after the Jews lived there and were the indigenous people. Now, they were exiled, and the truth is most indigenous people either were wiped out, as the Aborigines in Australia, or the Indians in America, or the Eskimos in Canada, or they either wiped out or they were completely crushed in their cultural life. The amazing thing is that the Jews survived exile and never gave up their hopes, their dreams. You all know, I'm speaking to a Jewish audience, how next year in Jerusalem was the end of Yom Kippur, of the Seder, of every major Jewish event and activity, of a brit, of a circumcision, of prayers in so many different ways. So the Jews are the indigenous people, not the colonial settlers. And in fact, Jews lived in Israel all those 2,000 years of the exile, although they were persecuted and despised minority. The Muslims who captured Israel in the 8th century were followed by other Muslim rulers, be they, and of course, in the last few hundred years, the Ottoman Empire. But their conquest, and that's the second point why it's a lie, their conquest does not justify their own any more than they accept that Israel's conquest of the West Bank gives it the right to own and to control the West Bank. So the fact that they conquered it hundreds of years ago doesn't change the basic reality that the land of Israel is a Jewish homeland, and coming back to it was every morally and humanly justified right. And so part of this whole exchange to claim that it's is a lie, and that brings me to the third lie. The claim that they are settlers, meaning that they could go back home, as the British did after when they left India, or as the British did when they left Kenya and Africa. It's a complete lie, because the Jews overwhelmingly were born in Israel. There are 800,000 Arab Jews. 50% of the Israeli population are descendants of Mizrahim, of Arab Jews who lived in Arab lands in the Middle East, in other words, all those years, and who were driven out, expelled by pogrom and by literal expulsion, and by riots and by violence and by government confiscation of their territory. So the truth is, far from being settlers who can go home, the Israelis overwhelmingly consist of 250,000 survivors who survived the Holocaust and were driven out of Europe and who chose not to live in the graveyards of their families, of 800,000 Arab Jews, of 1.5 million Russian Jews who escaped the oppression and the persecution and discrimination in Russia. So all three are lies. And of course, their lies in service are a really cruel idea. The cruel idea is that if you are a colonial settler, then they have a right to kill you, and you have no right to live and exist. And that itself makes a farce out of the greatest example of the end of a colonial settler state, namely South Africa, which had the good fortune of a Nelson Mandela, who, when the minority whites gave up a systematic oppression, apartheid, that is the opposite of what Israel does with its Arab population. When they gave it up, yes, it could have been mass murder of the whites, mass expulsion of the whites, and Mandela had the greatness of spirit and of responsibility to not let that happen. The tragedy of the Palestinians is that their Mandela, namely Arafat, did not have that. And when the Oslo Accords were made and set up a way in which the Palestinians could become and create their own state, Arafat chose to simultaneously continue supporting terror, paying them secretly, organizing them, working with them, and throughout the years trying to undermine the right of Israel and denying, by the way, of course, Arafat famously or infamously denied that there was ever a temple, Holy Beit HaMikdash on the Temple Mount, and one could go on and on. Of course, all the denials were to justify the idea of wiping Israel out. So the cruelty of this and the fact that this is supported by human rights organizations or by so-called progressive people to justify, in effect, the mass murder, even of colonialists, there's nothing that justifies such a crime. And this is an example then of using lies to justify would-be genocide and cruelty. And this is the Palestinian tragedy, that they have not turned their back. And I blame their allies, yes, including the so-called progressive Democrats, for instead of weaning them from this hatred and from this secret hope to undermine the state of Israel, telling them, we support your right to national statehood, but you have to give up the dream and the actual activity of terror in order to be worthy of this dream. And let me just take one or two other, three other points before turning it back to you and giving you a chance. I welcome your questions and your responses too. One is the United States, which has given remarkable support and important support to Israel, and there's a great sense of gratitude and appreciation. On the other hand, has put tremendous pressure on Israel not to go into Rafah and said it will threaten to withhold arms if the Israelis go into Rafah, whereas the Israeli public, and overwhelmingly in my judgment, believes that if they don't go into Rafah and wipe out or degrade the last 4 unbroken battalions of Hamas, that Hamas will regain power and regain control of Gaza, and we're back in the old situation again. So the Israeli public overwhelmingly supports an invasion of Rafah, and the America is saying no, and that is part of the challenge right now. Secondly, Biden and the American government have proposed the Palestinian state, that we offer the Palestinians the incentive to turn on Hamas by saying you can have your own state. Now let me speak again. Israel, the majority of Israel right now, I would estimate 80% are against the Palestinian state. 20%, and that includes me, would still accept one. But why is this 80% against? The truth is, majority of the Israelis were for a Palestinian state. And the history will show, I'll show in a moment, that the Jews accepted the Palestinian state. Repeatedly, the Palestinians or the Arab nations, which represented them in the first 30 years, turned down the chance to have a state because they were determined to wipe out the Jewish state, and they prioritized that over establishing a Palestine. I give you 1948. The UN resolution was a partition resolution, that the 2 states emerge, a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. And the tragedy was that instead of accepting it, the Jewish people, the Zionist movement accepted it. The Arab nations invaded trying to destroy Israel, and they failed. And as a result, the Israeli state came into being in the Palestine. Now in 48 to 67, for those years, the Arabs controlled the West Bank, Jordan controlled the West Bank. They could have set up a Palestinian state, but they didn't, because they prioritized wiping out Israel, economic boycott, military and terrorist activities, et cetera, et cetera. So again, they turned down the chance to have it. In 1970, Israel offered to negotiate with them after the Six-Day War to return lands and to enable a Palestinian state. The response of the collective Arab nations was no negotiations, no recognition, no peace. And of course, turned down again. And in 2000, Ehud Barak was elected by a majority of Israelis to be prime minister on a platform that said, set up a Palestinian state, give back 95% of the West Bank in order to enable a Palestinian state to emerge. But the Palestinians refused to accept this offer because it meant they'd have to give up their dream of wiping out Israel and accept the Jewish state's right to exist. And in 2009, Ehud Olmert made an equivalent offer. And again, the Palestinians turned it down by not answering, not responding. So my point is, and this is their tragedy, that the Palestinians do have a Nakba, a disaster on their hands, but they have done so because of their failure to take the road of establishing a peaceful, successful state, and have consistently prioritized wiping out the state of Israel. And this is the moment of truth again. My answer to the question that, so 80% of Israel now consists of people who oppose the Palestinian state because 40% of them are settlers and people who support them. And by now, Israel has built so many settlements, 500,000 people would have to be uprooted, they believe, if they recognize, and their life would be made impossible by a Palestinian state. But the other 40% are people who would have and can still be convinced to accept the Palestinian state, but they believe that the state would be lethal, would be devoted to destroying Israel, who think to themselves, what if Hamas had controlled the Palestinian state? And on October 7th, but they launched the attack not from Gaza, but from Jerusalem, from the West Bank. So they could have killed not 1,000 people, but 100,000 people. and they could have destroyed the Knesset and the Supreme Court and the wall and all the central institutions of Israel life. So that 40%. So what's my answer to this question? I propose to all of us should propose to the Biden and to the administration and to the national community that the Palestinians should earn their state and that Israel would be open to their convincing the Jews and the Arabs of Israel that they intend to live in peace. And they can do so with 3 simple steps. One is democratization. Right now, the Palestinian Authority and Gaza are both dictatorships. They'd have to accept the democracy because no democracy has carried on genocidal war against its neighbors. They'd have to have a democracy because otherwise there's not a democracy when they fail economically, when they fail to deliver, when they are destroyed by corruption, they immediately blame Israel, and so they will be a threat. And so the first step is democratization, to allow a free press and new figures to apply, including groups that want to live in peace with Israel, run for office. Second step, to turn to the economy and to build it, and that's the irony. There's great support even in Israel and from Israel for people, startups, for technology, for all the things that Israel is great for the Palestinians, but they have not been able to flourish because of corruption and because of government pressure. And so the second step is to turn from terrorism and undermining Israel to building a free and flourishing economy in which they had a lot of help. And the third step is to stop the terrorism. And here again, what do you mean stop the terrorism? The answer is the population, the Palestinians, both in West Bank and Gaza, if they really condemned it, if the Arab nations really said this is unacceptable, could suppress, or if that fails, tip off the Israelis that the terrorists are coming. And a simple conclusion that nationally to renounce terrorism, then every would-be killer, every would-be terrorist understands that when he goes out, even as a lone wolf, that for every Israeli he kills or for every bomb that he plants, in fact, will delay the state, then the national will of the Palestinian people would suppress the terrorism. Those are 3 simple steps that would turn the state from a mortal threat to Israel to one that could live side by side. But that needs pressure. And as you know, the polls show right now the opposite. 80% of the West Bank Palestinians support what Hamas did on October 7th. Under those circumstances, no rational Israeli, including the leadership that will replace Netanyahu, in my judgment, would accept this kind of working process to convince the possibility of a future Palestinian state is worthy. That's my last comment is, of course, about Netanyahu and the present government. It is a tragedy that this moment of suffering and of conflict and of crisis that our leader, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the far-right extremist coalition that he leads. This extremist coalition has yielded statements, really genocidal statements. Just 2 weeks ago, Smotrich announced again, we need total annihilation of Gaza and of the Palestinians. Just months ago, Shmuel Eliyahu, a minister of the government, said publicly again that our animals are inhuman. We should treat them as animals. We should nuke Gaza and things like this. These statements are devastating. They're awful. They're evil, and they do not reflect the Jewish people's will, and they do not reflect Israel's actual policy. But because of his political survival, and Netanyahu has failed to rebuke these people. And so before the International Court of Justice, South Africa claims genocidal intentions, and it cites these statements, and these statements, this is outrageous, have not been condemned and not been rebuked by the Prime Minister. And I feel that is one of his greatest sins and disservice of the Jewish people. Same thing, humanitarian aid. Weeks before it became a public issue, Israelis recognized that there was a shortage of food and the risk of mass famine. And yes, despite the fact that they're at war, despite the fact that the hostages were not being returned, Israel recognized it cannot allow mass starvation. And despite the fact that Hamas is to blame because they were grabbing the food that was coming in, Israel began to send humanitarian aid. But they never said so because Netanyahu could not offend Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who objected to any statement of sympathy for the Palestinian civilians died, who warned Netanyahu not to send an aid, wanted not to send an aid, who want to see Palestinians wiped out and killed. And so by not repudiating them, he has given the cannon fodder to the international court to condemn Israel. And I fear there may yet still be further moral fallout, disastrous fallout, his reputation. So my truth is the polls show that if there were elections today, Netanyahu and the far right would be turned out of office, that Smotrich's party wouldn't make the minimum threshold of election, and so on. The Israeli public does not want to have this kind of a government. But because it's a democracy, they can't bring elections until there is the basis for it and some elements of the coalition break down or collapse, or that Netanyahu and some of his followers resign. So I consider this part of the tragedy that we are suffering, and Israel is taking a tremendous hit to reputation. So I conclude with this. This is a challenge now, speaking to Jews who I believe legitimately and want to support Israel and its right to exist and its right to defend itself, and who understand the tricks and the distortions that have enabled undercover support for the Palestinians' attempts to cripple Israel's capacity to defend itself. But on the other hand, this is a moment of history that I think the whole Jewish people has to stand together. Stand together how? One, in supporting Israel's right to self-defense, but no less in supporting the leadership of Israel that wants to minimize Palestinian casualties, that's willing to support those Israelis who are willing to let the Palestinians earn the credibility and restore the possibility of a state. As a Zionist, I say this. The main idea of Zionism was that every people is entitled to sovereignty, self-determination, self-rule, and the Jews included, and it's anti-Semitic to deny the state or Zionism the right of Jews to have this, but also believe every people should have it, and therefore, if the Palestinians will turn peaceful, turn responsibility, we'd give them that opportunity. I think we have to encourage them. We have to challenge and confront their false, misleading allies, whether it's the Muslim populations that have come to America or to Europe and brought the anti-Semitic traditions with them. We have to confront them, but they have to give it up as part of their Americanization. We have to confront the human rights organizations that have sold out and defend genocide and remind them that their task is to fight for human rights. And the human rights of the Palestinians will be achieved only when their leadership is changed and transformed, and when their people are convinced, and they should be convinced by the human rights organization, to live and let live. And finally, I believe we have to understand this is a pain, that right now our right to have a land of our own, a nation of our own, means that we are prepared to fight a war in every generation. It means sacrificing our children. The story of the Akedah, of Isaac being bound to the altar by Abraham, I've always been fascinated by it, because Abraham, after all, was almost ready to sacrifice his own child. Yet the Torah says, God says at the end, you should not and cannot and will not do that. So I understand, well, why do you tell the story then? Why do you tempt him in the first place? The meaning of the Akedah is very simple in my judgment. The Torah is telling us that to be a Jew, to defend our lives, to defend our people, it means that we have this horrifying and fateful risk of having to sacrifice the lives of our own children and grandchildren. But in order to maintain ourselves, to stay alive, we have to do that. So the Israeli public has taken on this responsibility. it is said, we will live in this country, we will defend ourselves, we will build a great society. This is a new age of Jewish history in which we have sovereignty, in which the Jewish people is able to defend and protect itself. And World Jewry is part of this, our alliance, our support. But as I say, World Jewry can help Israel negotiate this very narrow path of a morality that is not undermined by self-defense. And that it supports Israel politically, not to let the enemies of human beings and the anti-Semites steal America or other support away from Israel. It's a major challenge. It's sometimes heartbreaking responsibility, but it's a privilege to be alive. When you think back to 60, 70 years ago, they were killing millions of Jews, more Jews being killed every day, but not just one day, but every single day, year after year. And the Jewish people had no capacity to defend itself. The amazing miracle is that now we do have the capacity to defend ourselves. And we can't stop tragedies. We can do our best, but we can't absolutely prevent tragedies like October 7th. But we can end them immediately. So it's a privilege to be alive in an age when Jews can defend themselves, offer haven and guaranteed escape and protection for any Jew who is endangered. At the same time, to be able to exercise our power morally and with great restraint. This is something each of us can join in, and it's a privilege to be alive and to be responsible in this new age of Jewish history. And I personally believe that after this war, that the Israeli public will rebuild and renew not just Gaza, but rebuild and renew the state of Israel on a higher level than ever before, so that the sacrifice of our children, but the sacrifice of our blood and sweat and tears will be transformed into a higher level, moral, just society with equality and dignity for its Arab and its Jewish citizens, and with living in peace with its neighbors. Thank you.
Great, thanks to you. I have a few questions. I know that it's already
Please.
Eight?
Looking forward.
Here's what I want to say to you. First of all, gratitude and great respect for you as a teacher, and on me as your student. I'm grateful to you and always have been for all that I've read and heard you say, tonight included. I want to relay a couple questions. One of them is my own question. I want to ask you to think about and ask us in the category of how did we get here? I want to relay at least two questions. And one is somebody else's. I'll quote her in a moment. My question is, we're seeing two different issues happening at once, or one revealing the other. One is a war between Gaza, or actually Iran and its proxy in Gaza, and the Israeli public and the Israeli military, and what's the repercussions are around the world in terms of support or lack of support for Israel. The other is what we're noticing, seeing glaringly on our campuses. And one of the things that's happening on our campuses is that we're seeing that the extremes are the ones who are showing their faces and showing us that ultimately they've been working on a system to bring us to this point in history. It seems that there's nothing random about what's happening in Gaza. It was trained and it was delineated and planned. And it seems also that the funding and the planning also has gone into this moment in history in America. You and I, I'm sure, agree that the majority of people that we know and love are essentially centrist, left and right. We veer around the middle on most issues. But in the corners, at the edges, as you say, are the ultra-progressive on the left and the heinous on the far right. That's where we find in both places anti-Semitism emerging. Right now, it seems that the most dangerous systemic anti-Semitism is coming from the far left in this country and in Europe. What's your thought on that? And then I'll relay the next question. What's your thought on its origins, also on how that might change America and how we might ultimately combat it?
It's a very important question. And I start by saying I am guilty, like many others, of being too serene and too optimistic. The truth is, after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism was so discredited. And in effect, if you were an anti-Semite, you had to say, I'm in favor of killing women and children and gassing people by the millions. So I really had the illusion, or at least hope, that in fact it was permanently discredited, and that yes, the amazing American experience of pluralism, in which Jews were allowed to be Jewish without being discriminated against, was here to stay permanently. I underestimated the dangers to democracy and to liberalism. And of course, I don't want to get sidetracked, how vulnerable democracy is. And even America, I think there are very serious threats to democracy and its future here. So that is certainly part of it. And it was doubly shocking then that when this war broke out, that all these extremes came forward and even stronger. So my answer is, yes, all of us have to become more realist. However, my argument is, if we are realist, we can deal with, I still believe the majority of Americans, now, as you said, and the majority of the Jews are really centrist. And I think these protests and the outright support for Hamas in its most violent and vile forms is way beyond what the American public in its majority feels. The polls show still 80% of Americans supporting Israel in this war. But more important than that, I think if we strike back now, and this is the key answer to your question, I think we have to not be afraid, and we have to fight back. Fight back means politically going out in full force in the Democratic Party, which is at stake now, as well as in the Republican Party, and pushing our agenda legitimately, so that Israel is the safest and best ally for America, that Israel is a moral country, that Israel is a democracy with all its flaws, and that America should continue to be the ally that it deserves. And America is the world leader of freedom and democracy. I think if we make that campaign, we will find much support. Now, we're disillusioned and maybe upset that a lot on the left, including the feminist organizations that didn't condemn mass rape of Jewish women, were condemned, and we are shocked by it. But my answer is, in 1967, many of us active in the Jewish-Christian dialogue were deeply disappointed that the Christians did not speak up in advance. But what did we do? We got organized, and we said after the war, we haven't communicated to you well enough how important Israel is, etc. We have to do the same thing here, including the confrontation. For example, again, the Muslim populations, including in America, where CARE, the Council, on American Muslim relations, has made statements that are basically supportive of Hamas. I think we have to not be afraid to be labeled Islamophobic, but to say publicly that these are the abuses, that what Christianity did for 2,000 years, spread anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews, which they apologized for, and which, since no state had to have done a major repentance, is what Muslims have to do now. And part of their adjustment to America or to France or to England is to accept the rules of democracy and to show respect instead of hatred for their fellow citizens. We have to say that, and again, my answer, we have to learn to say this without fear and not allow this to be suppressed by the claim of being either intolerant or Islamophobic and so on. In other words, the key to what I'm answering to your question is we have to walk this nuanced point and reach out to find the center. I think if we do that, we will be able to leverage that to put pressure on, exclude the extreme right, and to push the extreme left into the margins where they should have been all along. And yes, if we work at it for a long time, I think we have to launch a major drive to strengthen Zionism, to reassert why we're Zionists, to reassert the truth of Israel compared to, not just to the Middle East, compared to democracies throughout the world. It's a rebuilding job. It's a major task, but I believe we can do it. And we have to do it. That can be part of our contribution at this moment to Jewish history.
Let me relay a question by a wonderful Druze woman, Rania Fadeldin. She asks, how did we get to this conception in the first place when we, for years, gather intelligence using Mossad, Shabak, CIA and technology. And above all, our enemy never hid their agenda. I think this is important. In fact, they were constantly trying out to execute it, especially since the Second Intifada. Where did we fail here? Israel, America, our intelligence allies.
Okay, I mean, again, the honest answer, is it starts by admitting we made that failure. And again, you can make hostile versions of that. You know, some of the people who are anti-Israel said, for example, reports that Hamas was organizing and training were found by the women soldiers who were the observers at Tatzpah and the Gaza. So they weren't listened to, they were dismissed. So again, hostile Israeli to Israel people say, well, you see, because they're sexist, they don't listen to women. My answer is there was a whole compound of factors, including, and this is the main thing, that they were tricked. And I have to give Hamas that credit. They were tricked because they wanted to believe that Hamas was turning from all these statements and all these written commitments to kill, and that it was now trying to govern and build the economy. We wanted to believe that. And again, so let's put it honestly, we were tricked, but we were tricked because of our goodwill and our good nature and our desire to believe the best of our enemies. So my answer is, don't be arrogant. As smart as Jews are, or as effective as the CIA is, there's no guarantee that they won't end up making major misjudgments from time to time, or they can be tricked from time to time. The only achievement, as I said again, is we can fight back and stop it once we make the mistake and realize it's a mistake. So my answer to you is that I hope in the future we will have learned from this lesson to take those threats seriously. And I hope in the future we will have less illusions. Just as Israel in the famous Yom Kippur War, 1973, they got reports from inside spies that the war is coming, but they were so convinced that the Egyptians are not good fighters and the Egyptians are not able to do this, that they ignored it. We're all human. We all have hypotheses, and sometimes the hypothesis leads us to block out the information. However, once the war broke out, Israel, in its remarkable comeback, at a very heavy human cost, regained control, and for the next 50 years, avoided those kinds of self-delusions. So I hope we'll have the same lesson this time again. In other words, I think, yes, the people who felt guilty resigned. People, even those who were innocent, they didn't do it deliberately or viciously, resigned. And I believe, even though he doesn't want to, that Netanyahu will have to resign or should resign, just as the generals and the others who accept responsibility will resign. And hopefully the future people will learn from these lessons. The lesson, again, I say, is that we have to be realists and dreamers at the same time. Dreamers believing the Palestinians can improve their lives and change their paths. And realists at the same time measuring accurately and carefully what they're actually doing. And the same holds true with the Muslim populations, and the same holds true with the radical left as well as the radical right. Monitor them and see if they can be marginalized or if they can change too. And call a spade, or tell people you can't present as progressive left when you're supporting genocide and hatred and anti-Semitism. We have to say it again and again.
Thank you. Let me relay a few questions and comments. Susan, you write, thank you for clarifying what the Israeli people want and need as compared to what the extreme right parties are declaring. Would you please explain how and when Bibi's coalition can be turned out of office? I think some of liberal Americans may be partially mollified when that occurs. And my question to you is, in relation to Susan's question, we want to see resignations because to some degree it's satisfying, right? After a debacle like this, I think that happened after a 67 war, or actually 73 in Israel as well. What's your sense in response to Susan's questions and comments? What do you think the turning point looks like for new elections, a referendum election, some change to happen in leadership?
Good. You know, first of all, again, I want to remind you, all governments make mistakes. Dictatorships make mistakes. democracies make mistakes. Sometimes democracies too go on, not just make a mistake, but go on paths or on policy sequences that are really quite negative. The difference between them is, however, in a democracy, at some point you'll have a mechanism or a way of admitting the mistake and correcting it. And dictatorships not. So you may start out the same place, but cumulatively over the years, dictatorship gets worse and worse because they can't admit and they can't acknowledge, and they have no provision for changing leadership so that they can make corrections. Democracies do. And to me, that's the key to what we're describing here now, that taking responsibility, that's part of democracy also. And that's what happens if the government, even for good intentions, did a ruinous policy. You have a chance to turn them out in the next election and get somebody who hopefully can do better. Now, that's what I believe is before us. And I think correctly, Susan said, if that was done, I do believe it would win back respect and trust, more respect and trust for Israel, especially among the moderate and the centrist groups that we are the key to our future. So that's a major question and a major way I believe it will happen. Now, the question is when, and this is the interesting problem. So I say very bluntly, if the Israeli public could, it would happen right now or in the next few months. And there is overwhelmingly national support for new elections. 73% of the Israelis in a poll about 3 weeks ago said that Netanyahu should resign, there should be new elections. And I believe that is the will of the Israelis. Now, here's the paradox. It's a democracy. And in a democracy, you can't get a new election unless a majority of the Knesset votes no confidence. And right now, the coalition with the extreme right is holding together. And I understand why, because they understand that if they break, the public will turn them out of office. And that, in fact, the polls show now it would be reversal. The present coalition has 64 seats. The opposition would have 64 seats in the new poll right now. And the present coalition would drop to 47, a huge drop, and it reflects the disillusionment of the public and the recognition of how bad they are. It would drop even more, except for the fact that the Haredi parties, which are a key part of the coalition, which have roughly almost 20 votes between them, the Haredi parties, their vote doesn't change by policy because of bluntly they're kind of a lobby for themselves. But I believe, and so they vote for their parties no matter what. And they are, up to now, their tactic has been, whatever the coalition, we join it and we get paid off and we give the leaders of the coalition the right to do anything they want to do, good or bad, as long as we get our payoff, which is not only financial support, but draft exemption. Now, my judgment, that era is over. That era is over too. So what's going to happen? My answer is, I believe that either because of the draft exemption, there will be a revolt within Likud and the government will fall if they try to pass the draft exemption law, which is impossible. The government, the army needs more personnel. And in fact, the economy cannot sustain the welfare that Netanyahu has granted to the Haredim and grant money to their school system without teaching basic core curriculum that enables them to take jobs. So the truth is their time was running out, but I think October 7th has made that decisive. So I believe that the government, if it tries to pass the draft exemption, will collapse from the Likud inwardly. Secondly, if that doesn't happen, there will be, in my judgment, there'll be overwhelming demonstrations, greater even than last year, which stopped the judicial review. And last year, too, people said, how can you stop this? They have the majority coalition. But the answer is, it is a democracy. And even though there's no legal way they could have forced it to stop, the sheer impact of that broad scale objection stopped it in its tracks. I think the same thing's going to happen now. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope, in fact, it will break up before then. But I believe that, therefore, we're talking months. I wish it were days and weeks. We're talking months, not years. And Netanyahu has this illusion that he can delay the election and the democratic process until 2026. I don't think there's a chance of that because of the overwhelming reality of the Israeli public. So stay tuned. I can't give you an exact date, but I believe it will come sooner than later, because in the end, I think the Israeli public wants a democracy, but it wants a government that's responsible. It wants a fair share in which the ultra-Orthodox have a fair share of responsibility for army service and for putting their lives at risk for the Jewish people. So I hope as soon as possible, and we'll take some PR setbacks in the interim, but I think it's coming soon. And if you ask me to guess, I think we're talking months, but not years.
You've covered a lot, an enormous amount. You haven't mentioned Saudi Arabia because we haven't talked about the regional politics. But don't you think that they're going to play a pivotal role in what happens next in that region?
Thank you for saying that. Saudi Arabia, an interesting point again. The truth is that the normalization, and I will give credit to the American government. Of course, it started with Trump and the Abraham Accords, and now Biden with Saudi Arabia. The American government has gone out of its way to say, if you want a defense treaty with us, you'll have to normalize with Israel. That's a remarkable, and it's an extraordinary gift and support of an ally, and we should be honored and recognized. Secondly, Saudi Arabia's willingness to do this reflects the fact that even though they're way behind, they are trying to open up both the religion to more humane and more civilized and more modern practices. Women allowed to drive, it's not a great thing, but compared to the past. So my answer is, I think Saudi Arabia could play a constructive role, even though in my judgment, and I'm not happy with that, it's still very retrograde and it's still vulnerable to, like Sadat was assassinated. I think the Prince MBS is also at risk, and so on. So I recognize it's a major risk, and I'd be particularly concerned if the nuclear authorization to Saudi Arabia, because they could do what Iran is doing, which is to divert it to military use. Nevertheless, my answer is, I think Saudi Arabia can and should play a major role. And yes, part of working back in history is you can't pick and define and refine your allies. You have to deal with the realities. Just as I'm prepared to ally with Saudi Arabia that's trying to normalize and improve itself, and therefore trusted it's willing to normalize and improve, work with Israel, and of course, most important, because it wants protection from Iran. So I think this is something to look forward to. And in my judgment, the government, if necessary, the government should make a deal for normalization in terms for opening the possibility of a two-state solution without giving the two-state until they, as I said, democratize and change their economic and terrorist behaviors. But I think that can be done and should be done. And I think it will be a blessing. Look back at America. At the time, it was supported against England by the French monarchy, which was overthrown as undemocratic within a decade. That's the reality of history. Sometimes we had an alliance with Stalinist Russia to defeat Hitler. The answer is you have to do these things in history. The trick is to do them as necessary and to end them as quickly as possible, or correct them as quickly as possible.
Let me ask you, if I may, can I relay a couple more questions, Rabbi?
Please, please.
All right. Wonderful. Drew's woman again, Rania says, thank you for this super informative and moving lecture. You've mentioned that you accept a Palestinian state, and peace is indeed a wish for every decent human being. But my question, she says, is how can Israel ensure that a state for the Palestinians, which means airports, free trade, borders, etc., will not be the beginning of a non-turning point, God forbid? After all, the ideology of ignoring the right of existence of Israel is deeply rooted, as she knows, and as an Israeli Druze, among the Palestinians. And this desire is not a political circumstance, but ideological or religious duty for every good Muslim. Do you think that such a change in the mentality that we wish for in the Palestinians is possible and realistic after all?
You may be right, in which case it's not going to happen. However, again, my answer is, I keep saying we'll do this, we'll dream realistically. That means, as I said, it will take years. the Palestinians will have to actually deliver, meaning they have to democratize, allow new parties and new people to run. They have to shift to become, they have to eliminate, cut down, eliminate terrorism. These steps will take years. But my point is, Israel should say just that. Do it, and you can convince us. And we will, in fact, at one point I suggested, Freedom House, it measures democracy throughout the world. You think, well, we're tricking you. We're saying if you do this, we'll give you the state, but you'll never admit that we did it. My answer is, I'm prepared to appoint Freedom House, as an independent arbiter to measure your democratization. But so your point is well taken. Right now, we have to take them seriously. And if they don't show substantive and major transformation, and that will take years, then they will not get their state. And of course, when they do get their state, it has to be demilitarized as part of the arrangement. But that's what I'm saying, negotiate and make that an incentive to do that. Let me finish this answer by a comment about the Druses. Again, I said Israel's democracy, I'm proud of it, I support it, but it's a flawed democracy. In my judgment, the Druses have not gotten the support, the economic and social support from the government that they should, given their devotion, given their service in the Israeli army, and in my judgment, the Arab population of Israel also. It's not a perfect democracy. They're not fully equal. Their educational and economic achievements are not the same level. And I believe we have to invest more. And I'm disappointed we haven't done better. But I would say here, it's very much like America in the 60s with Martin Luther King. The way to go is to say, live up to the American dream and improve. And there have been significant improvements. And King was correct in saying, you don't disdain America, you don't reject it, you don't turn it into the worst state in the world, etc. You don't say death to America, all these things that the extremists in America, pro-Palestinians, have been saying. So I think together we have to do both. We have to incentivize and connect to the moderates, to the new forces inside Palestine, and make clear to the others that it's not going to work. They're not going to get it and let them abuse it. We're not going to let the Palestinian state exist that could vote for Hamas as they did in 2006 in a majority election. So this is their opportunity and their challenge. And at the same time, we have to work on raising Israel's level of democracy for everybody. And there has been major improvement in the Arab condition as it is now, and in the Druze condition, but there's room for significant further improvement. And I believe that the new administration or the new coalition that will come in will do a major effort in this area. To be fair, the coalition led by Netanyahu earlier, not the most recent one, but the previous one, started a 5-year major plan to upgrade investment in the Arab community. So it's not that they're all totally negative. The present extremist doesn't. It's crippled those efforts. But I believe the coalition that follows of moderates and even a future right-wing coalition will do what I'm suggesting, reach out to the Druze and Arab communities in gratitude and in allyship together to build a better Israel.
Levi, amen. May I ask you one last question?
Please.
I'm talking to college students on almost a daily basis and to their parents and grandparents. What would you say to American college students and their parents and grandparents who think the best thing to do right now is to hide their mezuzah, hide their Magen David, hide their Jewishness, leave campus because they feel threatened?
Yeah, well, the immediate, and I'm speaking immediate little moment, that's not such bad advice, and I understand it, and I say it's legitimate. I just say as long as we see it as worst, at best, as a temporary expedient, I would hope the majority will not do that. I hope America is not lost yet. And the college campuses, despite the atrocious leadership of its and giving in and allowing and tolerating this stuff, is not a lost cause. I think we have to simply go back and regain it. By the way, this is kind of a hidden blessing in disguise. I think they overreached. The extreme, the violence, the denunciation of America, the denunciation of death to America, the denunciation of Western values. I mean, I'm very sad. It shows that for 10 or 20 years, we've had this moral rot in which many faculty and the general atmosphere was to create this false morality of the woke, that the oppressed and anything they do is okay, and the oppressors and anything they do is wrong, and the Jews are part of the oppressors. So it was a triple lie again. It denied the truth that oppressors, the whites, the privileged, are not all there by oppression and privilege, but they earned it, that Asian Americans and others were able to take advantage of America to achieve the American dream, and that the continuing systemic racism is not the only reason why the blacks have not caught up, and we need to help them to catch up, but not in the process falsify America as if it's a total evil society. So we have a job to do, and I'm sad that this kind of false morality, so-called intersectionality, the claim that all the oppressed or outsiders are in this together. Therefore, if you're gay, you should support the Palestinians. It's a double lie again. First of all, because Israel is the best, most gay-friendly country, not just in the Middle East, but really among the leading in the world. And their rights and their protection, in their access, the Speaker of the Knesset, that's the Speaker of the House in America, maybe even more important, the equivalent of a vice president, is a personally gay person, and so on. And as you may know, Hamas, by contrast, literally kills gay people, throws them off the roofs. There's a constant flow every year of homosexuals who flee, gay people who flee Palestine or flee the West Bank or flee Gaza to save their lives and go to Israel. So that's a false intersectionality. And it's, of course, a false claim that Palestinians are people of color. The truth is that if you're talking color, then 50% of Israelis are Mizrahim, many of whom's color is not simple white, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of a double lie here. Misrepresent the Palestinians as people of color or Hamas as oppressed, when in fact they're oppressors and evil. And as a result, this corrupts and hurts the very people the oppressed supposed to help, and misrepresents the oppressed and misrepresents Jews and everything else. So, but there's now a reaction of having overreached and said this. I think they were ahead of their population and the public. I think we have to, that's why I keep saying we have to push back now. I think we have an opportunity to rebuild and to understand America, all of America, understand the falsity of these things, understand why anti-Semitism is wrong. Yes, Islamophobia is also wrong, but who's actually practicing and distorting values, that has to be said as well. So the answer is, this is our opportunity. It's very dismaying to have to fight for this right again, but we did and we could. Just as my argument is, just as there were 50 years of fighting before we had the breakthrough in the 60s. I think we have to just go back and do it over again. One of my great teachers, Rabbi Soloveitchik, once gave a talk, and I would never forgot it. He said, he said, if you look at the Jews, the first time around, they don't always succeed. He said, when we first, conquered Israel and the homeland, they did many things wrong and they were exiled. He said, but the second time around, they did a much better job. We rebuild, we learn from our mistakes. I feel the same way about this. It's heartbreaking to have to go back and fight again. But my answer is we should learn from these mistakes, lift our courage, take on our responsibility. Yes, put the kippah on, put the mezuzah back on. Talk to the American people. I think the American people are far more decent, far more humane. And I think throughout the world, there are more decent, humane people who can be shown and who can be inspired to join us. The dream of Tikkun Olam, of repairing the world, not just for Jews, of overcoming poverty, hunger, hatred, war, beat the swords into plowshares. These are still very remote, but there's been tremendous progress in this direction in the last 50 years. Poverty, 50% of the world population has been lifted out of poverty. These are amazing statistics. So my answer is we have to look at the positives of the last 50 years. We have to learn the old Jewish lesson. If at first you don't succeed, try again. If you fail, that's what Yom Kippur is about. Repent and change your behavior and choose life. And I want to finish with that comment because to me, this is the center of the religion. I've just finished a book which is coming out this summer, which argues that the central Jewish teaching about policy is simply choose life. Maimonides says choose life means not just the obvious thing. To save a life, you're allowed to violate, you're commanded to violate every law. To save a life, you override every economic and social concern to save lives. He says it's more than that. It means in every life action, you have a choice of life. The next word you say can be a word of death, meaning criticism, hatred, destructive, or it can be a word of encouragement, of life, of affirmation, of moral responsibility. The next food you eat, it's not just kosher. The next food you eat can be sugar-filled, salt-filled, poison that will kill you eventually, or it can be healthy food, vegetarian food. It can be lean, it can be sugar-free, not ultra-processed. Maimonides says every commandment of the Torah, including how to speak, including how to be honest in business, including how to be responsible and stuck and helping, is a statement. In this action, you can maximize life and minimize death. You can choose healthy food. You can choose through an electric car, which will have less carbon. There are thousands of moments every day when you can choose life. And part of the choosing life is to seek to heal and to help the oppressed and to seek and to give a chance for life for the Palestinians. But again, it must be done to maximize life and minimize death and to be sure to do it realistically and with good judgment. I do believe we have the capacity as Jews to renew and to rebuild and to redo. And think of it, the Holocaust, the greatest tragedy, catastrophe, destruction of Jewish history, was followed by the greatest outburst of life, creativity, restoration of learning and of Torah and of morality in Jewish history. So I want to say the same thing about this moment. The greatest setback in the history of Israel, the greatest moment of threat and disillusion, I believe should be responded to and can be responded to with a greater outburst of life, of morality, of compassion, of empathy, of human responsibility, and of increase of culture and religion and learning and music and arts and all the good forces. This is in our hands now. I believe the Jewish people respond October 7th, but we raised more money for Israel in 6 months than we had in a year or two. So the potential is there. And you know what? Let me go on record as a prophet. I want to predict it's going to happen. It's in your hands. The people who are on this session and many other sessions, it's in your hands. If you choose life, if you make these decisions, I believe the whole Jewish people will, the government of Israel will make these choices. And under our inspiration, maybe many other governments and many other peoples will turn to life. And I have this belief. At my age, I'm not so sure it'll happen in my lifetime, but I hope so. And if it doesn't happen in my lifetime, it'll happen in the lifetime of those who are listening, and certainly in the lifetime of the Jewish people and of the Jewish state.
Amen. I want you to have the last word. Every word you said was beautiful and wise and necessary and inspiring. I simply would be rude if I didn't thank you. So thank you so, so much. Happy birthday. God bless you. Keep you in good health and teaching and writing and inspiring and instructing us and giving us great wisdom that we could take into the Jewish world and for the world at large. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ritz Greenberg.
Thank you all, and thank you for the opportunity to talk together and to be together. Be well. Greetings and blessings from Jerusalem.
Best wishes to you and your wife and your family.
Thank you.
I'll give you the final word to make a concluding remark, and then we'll sign off. Thank you very much again to all of you as well for joining us for this important, inspiring evening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Greenberg, for your powerful, informative, and meaningful presentation. It was a fascinating and moving talk, and we appreciate the time that you spent with us. We are so grateful to you for sharing your wisdom and insight with us. You've given us a lot to think about, and we learned so much from you. It was an honor and privilege to have you here tonight, and you taught us a great deal about not only the situation in Israel and Gaza, but the historical background and about life. We gained a lot from your talk, and we can't thank you enough for offering to speak to us and teach us. Our Rabbi in Residence lecture series will be taking a short break for the summer, and we will be back soon with a lineup of new, exciting rabbis and scholars to look forward to. Be sure to check your VOS emails for our next session, and we hope you will join us then. Mark your calendars for the third Thursday of the month at 7:00 p.m. on Zoom, and you can find us on our website at vosla.org. I'd like to thank all the sponsors from this past year who generously contributed to our program. We appreciate and need your continued support. So if you would like to sponsor a rabbi for the upcoming year, please contact me. Thank you, Rabbi Greenberg. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy.